Hi, everyone. Welcome to our talk today. My name is Victor Cheng from SaaSceo.com. We have a great topic of discussion teed up for today. We're going to talk about what happens when your SaaS company has an executive team that's failing because it's full of friends and family. Touchy subject, very, very sensitive. Happy to introduce our guest speaker here today, Georgi Feidler from Hire, Train, and Inspire. She's a colleague of mine and friend. We've been working together for many, many years, and we've both struggled with this problem with our clients. So first off, Georgi, I want to welcome you and thank you so much for making time today.
Yes, thank you for having me, Victor. I'm really excited to have this conversation.
So just for everyone else's background, Georgi and I, we've worked together with a lot of common clients, or clients in common rather, and we've had this conversation privately for a long time, over many different years and many different clients. And it's a really common problem. And so Georgi, before we dive into sort of the nuts and bolts of things, could you just share a little bit about this issue of friends and family and being in leadership teams and executive teams, and kind of what's been your experience? When did you first notice this as a problem? And then we're going to dive into specifics.
Yes, for sure. So I didn't start off, advising founders. I started out early in my career as a person living inside their chaos that they create. So early in my career, I worked at a lot of high growth SMBs, startups, SaaS organizations where I saw up close and personal how hard and challenging it is to scale a company that's really built on hustle. As an employee, there's pain there. Like I lived that pain, no clear roles, no clear vision, leaders stretched thin, not sure who your leader is, reactive decision making, systems held together by duct tape and a prayer. And I remember being really frustrated by that and thinking, oh gosh, it shouldn't be this hard to do good work. And then as I kind of progressed in my career, I saw, on the deal side of things, pre-acquisition, post-acquisition, getting, capital investment from Bain and Goldman Sachs and how that can create some really stupid decision making. I watched a lot of brilliant founders burn out, not because they didn't care, but because no one ever taught them how to evolve from being the hero to the building and a system and being a guide. So I think that experience really left a mark on me.
Yeah, so I would say it's left scars on me. I worked in the chaos. I advise people that are leaders of the chaos. And I think between the two of us, I think we did the math, not to date ourselves, but we've had combined half a century of experience dealing with this headache. And I think on the topics of things that impact fast companies, tech-enabled services companies, startup companies, on the list of topics where it's an issue compared to how aware a founder or entrepreneur is aware of the issue, this is one of the highest, right? You need to have more sales. You need to manage costs. This is just one that's sort of beneath the level of awareness for most folks and has just a disproportionate impact. So we wanted to do this video and this interview because it's such an important topic and we've suffered so much, candidly, around this. So let's sort of get started. So Georgi, from your perspective and your experience, what are the signs, all right? What does a company look like when you're advising them or looking from the outside? Or what does it feel like for the founder when this is a problem, even if they don't realize why this problem exists?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think it's one of those things where they're so close to it that they don't even realize it, right? And I'm surprised that it's not talked about more commonly, because what we know about founders is that they build their early teams with friends and family, because when you're in it, that's who's close to you. So of course you're going to do that, right? There's no shame in that. That's not a bad thing. It's a natural thing. And it really works at first. It's actually, I would say, probably one of the requirements to get beyond that, that beginning startup stage, right? Because trust is the currency there. And that's the really important thing. But as the business grows, those same dynamics start to become the liability. So the people who helped you build it aren't always the ones who are going to help you scale it, right? And I think the trade-off there, what needs to be said, is that that's not betrayal, that's growth. And so that is such a key thing, because there's so much relationship dynamics and just a lot of gray area, a lot of fear of burning bridges and all of that. So I would say some of the signs that I see often are this idea of like burnout. You start to see a lot of turnover, or, anytime they're trying to create the vision or move it from lifestyle to legacy or a leverage business, right? You start to see the stalled growth that's really caused by reactive reactive leadership. And then there's the obvious things, right? There's no delegation or documented SOPs. Everything lives in the founder's mind or the heroes that they hired, right? Because the heroes that they hired they enjoyed that chaos. They enjoyed not really having a box and kind of moving all around, and with that, not being held accountable to things and kind of being able to do what they wanted when they wanted. So I think you see a lot of like undefined roles, a lot of misalignment, a lot of confusion, a lot of resentment that nobody's talking about, right? And when, I come in, I feel sometimes like I'm a therapist, because I'm asking questions and then, oh my goodness, I open a floodgate, right? And all of it comes. And then there's these emotional landmines from all these legacy relationships that make feedback and accountability almost impossible.
It's funny. I often feel the same way. And so, I'm not a therapist by any training. It sure seems that way at times. And I started changing some of my intake questions. Now I want to know not just the org chart, but how is everyone related to everyone else?
Yes.
Right? It's like, oh, she's your mother. Well, you could have told me that a year ago. That would have been relevant, right? Or he's your brother, or like, he's your best, he's like your wife's brother, your brother-in-law, right? And so like those things, like they don't often get sort of introduced at the outset, but like they can be really relevant when they're these personal ties that are not purely professional and not purely appropriate to the stage of the business, where they are now. And often I see these issues with companies personally that are successful, right? So the ones that are, bad business, bad idea, bad market, no product market fit, those just sort of don't make it. You
Right.
get the luxury, if you would, congratulations, you've graduated into a new class of headache, but it is a headache. So I think on my end, I've seen sort of similar things. I would say a lot of just this very, from a founder's perspective, like there's this vague sense that, wow, the business should be bigger than it is right now, right? And I sort of get called in, you often get called in, or I get called in first and I pull you in because we have some nice overlap, but we also they're very separate things. And it's a lot of like, I don't know why, but it should like sales should be better than it is. It shouldn't be so complicated. The competitor over there, they're worse than us, but they're growing better, right? Like it doesn't make sense to them. So there's sort of this missing X factor that's sort of a drag on the business is sort of the sense people have. And they're sort of hoping like when I get called in, like maybe I'll know because I've sort of been around the block and be 25, 30 years doing this. So that's sort of one sign. I think there's a lot of, if you ask the employees, it's like so-and-so is way up in my business on everything all the time, every single day, right? Or I'll say one thing and the founder will countermand my orders to my direct reports. I don't know who I'm reporting to. I'm getting messages and orders from two different places and they're in conflict. So you see a lot of that. Yeah. The visual I always have is my kids, when they're very little, they used to play soccer. And then it's, when you watch like 5-year-olds play soccer versus a professional sports team, all the 5-year-olds, they all run to the ball, right? All the kids on all the team, they all run around the ball in this big swarm, right? And
they all play all the positions.
They all play all the positions and the whole plan breaks down, but they're having fun and that's fine for 5-year-olds, right? But if you have a professional team, you're paying them millions of dollars, right? And compensation. There's roles, there's plays, there's a process, right? There's level of coordination, there's communication. It just runs very differently. So that's kind of the visual I have in my head. Anything you want to add to that before we get into like kind of root causes?
I think with that, right, like beyond, like we've kind of talked about, here's the symptoms and here's some of the things, right? I love that you brought up talking to the employees. Like that's a key part that we do when we bring in a new client, right? As part of our audit and assessment process. I'm talking to the people because I get one story from the founder, which is true. It's a true story. It's their perspective, right? But I get oftentimes very different perspectives from the team. And so often what I hear is founders are playing the hero, right? Not the guide. So the very people that also have that hero mentality are frustrated with the founder for being the same way, right? And then they're optimized for this survival, not really sustainability. And anything new starts to feel like a threat to that original team's identity. And I think there is this over-reliancy on urgency and familiarity, not capability and clarity, which makes it really hard to bring in anybody new. So that's oftentimes where founders go first is, and this is, where I start conversations with them often is, oh, well, we just need a person here and a person here. And they're trying to like solve it through new people. But those big resume hires or, even people who are coming from the outside often fail because the foundation isn't even solid enough to actually operate on, right? It has to be built first.
Got it. So let's talk more about that. So we have this issue with friends and family, sort of being in key leadership roles. But what it sounds like I'm hearing from you, Georgie, is from your perspective, there's also sort of a, like maybe a readiness in the founder to be able to work with, quote unquote, professional leaders, those with more skills where there's more of a formality and it's not based on personal relationships. Yeah, so let's talk about those two pieces. Let's first talk about a founder being ready to have a higher caliber level of direct reports. And then we'll talk about what are we looking for in the kind of direct reports rather than friends and family. Who should they be? So let's talk about the founders first. What are you seeing in terms of this? Think of a founder that's sort of used to, addicted, maybe wedded to the chaos, if you would, versus one that sort of made that transition and they're really ready and have the foundation to be able to support, a more professional senior management team.
Yes. So I think that the way that the mindset shift that is needed there is, again, moving from hero to guide and moving from here's all of this information and we can have a conversation that no one else could understand because we've been, down the rabbit hole and on this journey together for 5 or 10 years. And I can give you all the details and the how and this and that, right? To moving to here's the outcome that we're trying to achieve. Here's some guardrails and then set that up for success. And so I think, before I even get to let's go hire somebody or let's fill the gaps, so much of what I'm doing is, hey, if we want this to be set up for success, we're going to have to do some work first. We're going to have to build some foundation here. And so a lot of that is assessing the current team, right? Figuring out who's building, who's blocking, who's drowning, because there are all those types there, right? And it's like a chess game, right? It's like a puzzle piece. Some of the people they maybe are just in the wrong role, or we need to redefine and clarify the role and move them into a place where they can, be the greatest and best use of their skill set. Some people are not going to go on the journey, right? We pretty much know that right away. So once we've done that and we understand that, then it's okay, how are we going to go hire somebody if we haven't even articulated the vision and what it is that we're trying to accomplish, right? How do we engage somebody on that level? All the questions that they're going to ask. So I'm telling them, do you have answers to these questions? And, it's answers, but it all lives in their head. And so we've got to clarify the vision, right? Make it codified and simplified so that the team can align. So often I hear, oh, yes, I have a vision and my whole team knows it. And I love to ask that in my employee interviews. Like, what do you think the purpose of the company is? What do you think the mission is? And I get, if I interview 30 people, I get 30 different answers, right? Because it's not visible and it's not repeatable. And so that really gives clarity. Those two things, the assessment of the team and the vision, it creates the guide for the hard conversations. Right. And then from there, we can start figuring out, redefining roles and making tough calls. And if we do need to go and find somebody, we have a really clear idea of here's the specific gap and here's the problem that we're trying to solve. Because the other thing I've noticed about founders is that they create these Franken roles, is what I like to call them. Okay. It's like literally everything under the sun. Like, let me just slap this and slap this. And then you're looking for a unicorn that doesn't exist and is destined to fail. Right.
Yeah. So a couple of things that sort of jump out at me. So the visual I have in my head is moving from, the kids soccer field where, the founder is the star player that's, able to run the fastest on the field and kick the ball around while everyone sort of swarms with them, to pull them off the field and having them be head coach, right? Or having them be head coach of a program where there's multiple games that they're coaching based on a playbook, that kind of a thing. And I think a lot of it goes from being, I would say the big theme I see is going from implicit to explicit. And so when you're the star player and like you're better than everyone else, like it can work to a point where it's all in your head. You don't have to commit it to anyone else. You just need help, right? Like, and you're going to do your thing and they help fill in gaps. At some point, it gets too complicated where you have too many people. You start having like a layer or two of management, right, between you and the frontline workers. That gets more complicated. And things that you just think don't no longer magically just happen, because your span of control, the size of the organization is much larger. So you have to actually communicate, in writing, verbally. You have to convey a vision, right? You have to convey a set of values and words like that. And I think oftentimes those words sort of get associated either with the entrepreneur that's the big dreamer, I got a vision to go to the moon or to go to Mars or whatever, or Fortune 500 companies where it's sort of done, but sort of a lip service. There actually is a very practical value to having things like that. It just gives guidance to people to know what to do when you're not there making the decision, right?
Yeah, it's the guardrails.
It's the guardrails, absolutely, right? So when there is no manual for how to encounter something, we default to our values. If we're trying to make a decision, we ask, hey, is it on mission? Is it in alignment with the
Yes.
vision? If it's not, why are we doing this? And so it helps sort of distribute decision making, particularly lower level decision making, in a way where it's still in alignment. Maybe it's not exactly what the founder would have decided, but it's
Yep.
directionally correct. But the founder didn't have to get involved in like 9,000 decisions across, dozens, if not hundreds of employees.
Yeah, exactly. I think, when it's early stage, it needs to be hero based, and it needs to be, sentiment instead of systems, and relationships instead of roles, and, feelings instead of data. But you reach a point, right? And that might be different for everybody. That might be
Absolutely.
when you reach 2 million or 5 million or 10 million, but you will reach a point where it doesn't work anymore. And so it really is that mindset shift. And I think every founder is really different. Like I've worked with dozens and dozens of founders, and they have things that are true about them, right? Things that you have to have in your DNA to go and start this endeavor, but they're all different. And so depending on their self-awareness, their desire and wired, like how they're desired and wired, that really informs, how much can they keep up with the velocity of this seat as it grows. I've seen some keep up to 2 million. I've seen some keep up to 5. I've seen a few keep up to 50, but eventually you're probably going to come a point to your journey where you're going to need to replace yourself, not out of failure, but out of wisdom.
Yeah, I mean, I always think about staffing, particularly executive team, as more of a relay race rather than a marathon, right? And like no one's good, very few. Like the person that impressed me most over the years was Bill Gates. He went from one person business to 10-person business to 100 to 1,000 to 10,000 to 100,000 to trillionaire, $1 trillion company, right? And having worked in many parts of those phases of business over my career, they're all really hard and they're all really different. So that always
Yeah.
impressed me, of like he could transition himself. And so I often think about the relay race, and I want to sort of shift gears now to the other executives on the team, right? And the people that sort of start off as your head of sales or engineering, often they're not the ones to kind of take you to 10, 20, 30 million. And so I think if you sort of set the expectation, or at least I try to, that it's a relay race and you're the
Yep.
kickoff leg, right? And if you are successful, then you'll need to pass it to somebody else to do the next leg. If we're all unsuccessful, there is no next leg, right? And doesn't matter. So think of it as a graduation, if you would,
Yep.
rather than like a failure of sorts. So I think it's important. And, I have my sweet spot of what size businesses I work really, really, really well in. And that's sort of in that 3 to maybe like 25 million is what most of my clients are. Some that are
Mhm.
smaller, some that kind of go up to maybe 50, 60. I do not working
Yep.
with companies over 100 million, at least not anymore. I know you have your sweet spot. And
Yep.
they're just people who are good at certain stages. And it's just important for everyone to be aware of that.
Yeah,
So,
I think that's where that alliance conversation comes
mhm,
into place, right? There's a way to do it in a way that honors the person, right? And honors what they've contributed. But it has to be approached with a level of transparency. And that's why I think, that vision part, if you have that to look to, right, it makes that conversation so much easier, because you're like, well, here's where we want to go, right? I've had clients where once we did that, so much of the team opted out on their own, honestly. And
really?
I like, yeah, they're like, and we're just like, here's where we're going. Here's what's required in this next evolution, like getting really crystal clear on that. And they're just like, oh, yeah, I don't want that.
Right.
Oh, okay, cool. So let's talk about that. Like, what does that look like, right? What does transition mean? Because just because that velocity of seat is growing doesn't mean they can't be somewhere else in the business.
Yeah.
And there's also a different, oftentimes with these earlier employees, right? They have ownership stake, and so the thing that I talk about a lot too is there's the ownership hat, and that's one thing, and then there's like where you're at on the org chart and the role. So the two are not the same. And sometimes I think that there's the thought, well, if I give that up, I'm giving this up too. And no, you're not, right? It's two different things.
Yeah, I think that's a great way. So a lot of this is like setting expectations early, right? That there's the ownership path and there's the employee path of a particular job that you happen to be in right now. And
Yep.
those are together at the moment, but they may not always be. Having that conversation very early sort of sets
Yep.
the expectation. Set the expectation that this is all a relay race. I'm going to pass the baton as the founder and CEO at some point. Maybe I'm great from 1 to 10 million. I can't imagine running a $50 million business if we got it that far. Like I'm in way over my head, let's say. I'm going to pass the baton. And guess what? All of you are at some point too, right? But only if we're
Yeah.
successful, right? And so I think those are important things to set. What does it look like from a founder's perspective? How do they know when they've outgrown, a buddy that's maybe the VP of sales or head of engineering? Like, what are the telltale signs that, okay, that person's sort of hit their ceiling and it really is time to think about a transition? Any sort of thoughts around telltale signs about that?
Yeah, I think what I see a lot of times happening is as a founder, you start to get frustrated with the momentum, right? To your point earlier, they're like, I don't know, like we should be farther along. You start shooting a lot, shooting on yourself a lot. We should be farther along. We should be growing. And then their response to that, again, being the hero and the star player, is to just like dig in with that person even more, right? And then this person is like, oh, well, you're micromanaging me. I'm suffocating, right? Because they didn't want that either. And then it creates a lot of this resentment and tension in the relationship. But yeah, it's typically they want something to happen. This person's trying to make it happen. It's not about bad intention at all. It's just that it is a skill gap. It's a knowledge gap, right? That's what we're dealing with. And so often, I think because of the relationship, you see the founder, right? They're trying to shoulder the burden and carry that. And then other stuff starts to slip and then they start to get frustrated. And so much of what I've done in working with them is just being the objective third party, like calling that out and saying that out loud, right? Because what that prepares is setting the expectation with the founder. Hey, we're going to have to make some tough calls here. Like that's a reality of growth. And scaling isn't about replacing people, right? It's about repositioning them where they can win, if that's what they want, right? And that's where the alliance conversations to come in, because it's moving people with kindness and clarity, right? I always say clear is kind, clear is kind.
Yeah.
And so when we can get to that level, it becomes a really natural thing. When it's time for someone to step back out or out, they can do it with honor, right? And we can help the founder hold that line and hold the people as well, right? Because you have to hold both. You have to honor both.
And I think this is where experience really helps. And sometimes the founder, I find like a lot of the founders I work with, they're successful. They've gotten the business to a point where this is the biggest business they've ever run, right? Either they've never started one before, or they have, but the one they're currently running is the biggest. And so they're encountering problems they've never seen before. And these are problems that you've seen before, I've seen before. And I find like oftentimes it is, I'm surprised. For me, the telltale signs are often, there's some very basic things that sort of common sense wise, you would be able to expect to be able to ask your head of sales or engineering. And like, when's the release going to be done? Right. And like, it'll be done when it's done. Right. Which is not like a super encouraging answer. Or, hey, are we going to make our sales target like next month? We'll see. Right. So it's a lot of like very basic questions of, gosh, and oftentimes like a confidence thing, like, well, I don't know, like, is it I've never run sales before. So is it appropriate for me to ask ahead of sales, are we going to make sales next month? Right. And sometimes they just sort of don't know, but they think they ought to know, but they're not 100% sure. But what they do know, to your point, is they're frustrated, right? That things aren't happening. And the part that always surprises me is like, well, how long have you been frustrated? How long have you asked for blank and not gotten it? And I'm expecting a few months, maybe a quarter or two, and it's like years, right? Sometimes 5 years in some case, like, wow, you just been like not getting what you need out of that role for 5 years or 3 years. And the bulk of the time I have with my clients, them complaining to me about it. And like, well, we got to make a change, right? That's a sign of. We need to make a change. So those are a couple of signs I see, I think in specific functional areas. Like there's things that are very function specific. So in finance, it's more forward-looking financials rather than rear view. Under $1 million, you need a bookkeeper, right? Just make sure all the expenses, everything's accurate, right? And so that we know what happened last month. You get to a certain size, you kind of need more financial planning analysis. You need sort of fractional CFO, full-time CFO. And it's more, if we change pricing this way, if we change this channel, what will sales be in 2 quarters, right? If assuming churn goes down this way or up that way, what will sales be? And that's what you start needing, at a certain stage. I think in engineering, it's a lot more, structure, right? Like, what are we working on in 3 quarters? What are we working on in 2 quarters? What are we working on in the next sprint? And having some sense of visibility, rather than like, who knows what we'll get done? Who knows what we're working on? It's all changing constantly, right? You and I have had a couple of conversations on that before. I would say in sales, it's probably more sales forecasting and being able to hit target. Like, so if you're
and understanding the revenue levers too, like what are the revenue levers that I have to pull here, and what should I pull?
Yes, and then like, did it work? And then if it didn't work, what are you going to do to fix it? And if the answer is we're going to sell harder, right? That's sort of like, that's hero sales mentality. We're going to sell harder, as opposed to, we're going to work on
do more.
we're gonna do more, right?
We're gonna do
As
more.
opposed to we're in the wrong segment, right? Where
Yeah,
our lead generation source mix is the wrong mix, kind of given our data. We're going to target more of our ICP. We're going to put a negative incentive on selling outside of our ICP or ideal customer profile. And so there's like a
yeah,
level of like, here's what I'm going to do to fix it. And it's super concrete, it's super measurable, and I can evaluate it and themselves a month later. You as the founder can evaluate it a month later. It's pretty objective. And like, that's what
yep.
you would expect at a certain level. So any
Yeah, and
other areas?
it's a little bit of like an art and a science, I would
Yeah.
say too, right? Because
So,
so much of it depends on the founder themselves and the current team, right? And depending on the category and the niche and whatever, right? Your founder is going to have something that they lean towards, right? Oftentimes in SaaS, they're the product person,
yep.
a technologist, engineer, right? And you have to build around that. And if they are the product person or the technologist, what you can assume is that they're going to have like much higher expectations and desires on the engineering side and the product side. And so then that becomes, something you have to hire for and hire around, right? But then you also need to build them up where they don't have the strengths. I always say, hey, a person isn't well-rounded. Not one of us is, right?
Mhm.
But the team can be. And so it's really about recognizing those gaps. And then also you have to kind of find out what their hills are, like the hills that they're going to die on.
Okay.
And so all of they're all different. It's not really a consistency. I had one, like he just really, really cared about the merch, like the t-shirts and the hats. And all. He just really, really cared about that. And so when we hired a marketing person, like we just had to tell him, hey, he needs to see this. I know that is crazy. I
Yeah.
get it, but it's a hill. Like, I have another one, like he very much cares about word usage and language in terms of like how it's communicated to employees and customers. And it's a thing, it's a hill, right?
Yeah.
And so it's acknowledging the hill and building around that is really important when you're trying to shape out the executive team. And I think that so oftentimes founders, when they finally get out of, okay, yes, I need to move to the next stage. It's kind of this cathartic experience for them
Yeah.
because they're finally able to come to that realization. We make the tough call, we have the conversation, right? We're moving through that, and it's time for this next person to come on board. Oftentimes, like they're going after these big resumes, with these names and these very impressive, people who've done all of these things. And so that's another like potential pitfall, like a landmine that they can walk into, because oftentimes the people who have done all of these things and worked for these huge companies and are super, super impressive, they're not builders. They're operators within a very set system, right? With a team typically. And then you drop them into this lovely cluster and you're like, why aren't they doing what they did all this other stuff, right? And so it's very, very nuanced, right? There's a lot of gray there in terms of finding that next person who is going to be able to connect with the founder while the founder is also learning to lead entirely differently than they ever have before, right? And have the patience to kind of lead up and lead out as well. So I would say that that's another common pitfall that they're running into.
Got it. All right. So we talked about like, how do you know you have a problem? There's all this chaos, there's frustration, sort of people kind of running around. Root cause of that is you got the wrong people in sort of those seats. How do we transition from, okay, I recognize the problem, I see it, I know my team needs to change. How do we act? Where do we start? Do we do it all at once? Kind of what are your thoughts around that?
I think what I really approach there after assessing the team and kind of getting a good idea what the lay of the land is I'm asking what where are my single points of failure? I think that's the place to start. And they'll always be the biggest pain point to solve. Now, again, oftentimes founders once they get through there and they see there's a better way and they have this potential, they want to do it all at once. But from a change management perspective, from an adoption perspective, right? And if we want to have the rest of the team that still comes along with us, it's just not usually the best thing to rip everything apart all at once. So usually going to the greatest pain point or the greatest single point of failure and addressing that first, right? That's the place to start.
Got it. Yeah, I think I've seen similar things of, just for context, I've been fortunate to work with some companies from 500,000 in sales, like, 20 odd years ago, all the way to $200 million exit, right? Sort of that range. And in the companies my clients have been really successful. So sort of, start pretty small, grown into 10, 20, 30 million, something along those lines. I would say the majority I have been involved with or recommended or pulled you in to help execute, replacing probably at least half of the senior management team. And probably in many cases, 80, 90%,
Yep.
sometimes 100%. I can't think of a single one where no replacement's needed. Like not a single one in 25 years. And I don't know, Evie, what your experience has been.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, the reality of it is, as a founder, again, oftentimes to your point, this is the biggest they've ever been. This is the point, and they've never been beyond that, right? And when that's the case, right, you start to experience what I call founder thrash, right? You're not really sure where all of the pitfalls are and the landmines are, so you start to wobble, and you're like, oh, maybe it's over here, or maybe it's over here, maybe it's over here, right? Without a team that's built up around you that has been there, done that, right, that can point those things out, you're not going to be able to run as fast as you need to go, right? You're going to stall out eventually. And so while I think maybe there's some people who can make the transition, to your point, they can scale beyond, that's an exception and not the rule, right? Bill Gates is an exception, not the rule.
Absolutely.
And so we need to operate off of rules and patterns. And so if the founder is going to continue in the business, then oftentimes that means others can't. I mean, that is the reality of it, right? Now, if they are going to replace themselves, then maybe some of the other people can continue. But again, I go back to looking at the leadership team, the executive team, as this living organism and holistic, and we're trying to make it, cover the gaps. And so it needs to be well-rounded. And so that's looking at, if the founder is going to stay in, right, here's where they can be successful. What are the gaps left over? Who can fill those? How does that shape up? And again, sometimes that means that other people aren't joining you, right, beyond 5 million or 10 million or whatever that threshold is.
Yeah, I often find myself in conversations of like, what's the right time to replace somebody? And I don't think I've had a single, I don't know about you, but I've not had a single conversation where a client of mine replaced somebody too early, right? On
No.
average, it's a year or two or three late, but
Yep.
not a single one. So if you're debating it, it's probably already like a year ago was probably the correct answer.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely.
so let's talk. One question I often get and would love your take on is maybe this person can rise to the occasion, step up, kind of grow into the role. What are your thoughts on that sort of for an isolated individual? And what are your thoughts on that when it's like the entire team needs to rise to the occasion? What do you think?
Yeah. So a one-off, like, I'm willing to give that a shot if they have the right attitude, if they have a growth mindset versus a fixed mindset, if they are, the intentions there good, the efforts there good, right? They have a clear idea of what their gaps are and what they need to do to get there, right? But again, I would say that's an exception, not the rule. And you can't do that with the entire team. You don't have the time, right? The amount of effort and lift and time that it takes for that knowledge to be acquired, and the trial and error, because they haven't been there, done that before, and have the lessons learned, right? Have the scars, the battle scars. It's too significant and often comes at the cost of the business.
Yeah, I think my rule of thumb is, if you got a multi-person executive team, including the CEO and founder, you can have one person, maybe one and a half, right? In
Mhm.
some exceptions, that's growing into the job. You
Yeah.
can't have all seven for sure.
Nope.
And if the founder themselves is growing, right, and they're going, that's already one slot right there,
Right.
right?
Right.
I
They
think
take up a slot.
pick up slot, yeah. So I think it's
Mhm.
different if you're a phenomenal engineer, VP of engineering, you've managed 55-person teams, but now you're sort of more focused on sales and marketing, and that's new for you. And then you
Mhm.
have a rising star on the engineering team to sort of take over. And because you're so strong, you can mentor them to a degree. So you
Yep.
can spot problems in the one-on-ones. Maybe the one-on-ones are twice a week rather than the once a week. And you're willing to put in that time and train them up because they have such star potential. That's a maybe. That's a maybe,
Right.
right?
Yep.
But if you're having someone that's rising to the occasion in a functional area of which you have no experience, so you have two people that don't know what they're doing, like the head engineer doesn't know what they're doing, or the head of sales, nor do you know sales, right? Like that, I've not seen that ever work out.
No. And here's the other thing that I'll bring into it. As easy as it's not easy. As clear as that is, right? Like it's a proven concept. We've tried it again and again. It doesn't work, right? Here's the net. I think a lot of times, because of the friends and family and the relational dynamics, in order to have a successful transfer or a successful transition, both the founder and that person oftentimes have to go through it to get to the other side, right? So even if, there's a very low likelihood that they're going to make the jump that is needed, sometimes in order for the competence of that decision, right, to be shared by both sides, there has to go through a little bit of that, pain,
Yeah.
almost, or they have to feel that pain to get to the other side of clarity.
It's fun. That's usually when I bring you in because I don't want to deal with it. Like, Georgie, I need you. Come on, I get your butt in here. I go deal with this, and then I want the change, right? So you go. What are you gonna
Yeah.
do? Let's get the change in sooner the better. But they got to, and I don't want to deal with that, right? Because like I know the
Yeah.
person won't cut it, right? And I just want to jump to the answer and let's get rocking and rolling.
Yeah.
So yeah, you get all my referrals when I don't want to deal with that. It's too much for me. So full transparency.
People are wonderfully gray and complex, and
They are. They are.
that's what we love about them, and that's what drives us crazy about them too. So.
Absolutely. Yes. It's a yes. And all right. So it's maybe replace, one at a time, right? It's sort of, and I've seen that too. It's like, once you get into it, it's really hard to go hire really well, particularly at the C level or VP level. So I usually have, do one at a time, get it right. Also, the other reason why I like doing one at a time is because you don't know who you're going to get in advance, right?
Right.
So
Right.
maybe you need a head of sales, then you need a fractional CFO, you need someone to do pricing analysis, but you get a head of sales that used to do pricing analysis. So maybe you don't need that same role for the CFO. It could be a little bit different. It could be someone more fractional, maybe a little bit more to budgeting. And so with every add to the team, depending on what they bring to the table, you can potentially change the descriptions of the roles for everyone else on the team. Or if you have someone who's phenomenal at sales, but they're really weak at rev ops, revenue operations, sales operations, administering systems and doing analysis, then you might expand the job description of the other roles you got to fill. So when you do them all simultaneously, you might not end up getting the coverage. So I kind of like for the big senior roles, sort of one at a time, and then make sure they're stable and then sort of add. So you can replace the whole team inside of a year. It will be pretty quick, sort of one at a time, a quarter and change for each. But that's something that I see. All right, so we have this. Anything you want to add before we get into sort of case studies and stuff?
No, I agree. I think it's about the adoption and the change and understanding. The only thing I guess I would add there too is when you're bringing in people, especially if they're, you don't have everything buttoned up and beautiful, which you don't, right? It's being aware that we need to be really intentional about that ramp up plan to get them plugged into the business. So if you want it to be effective and not take them a year to ramp up, right? Being really, really intentional about here's the stuff that we need to put in front of them. Here's the things that they need to learn so that we can get that, ramp up very quickly and they can start having immediate impact. And again, part of that is hiring people who aren't going to get freaked out by reporting to a founder. They can lead up, they can lead out, they can build and scale, right? They can build and operate. So that's the two, they need to have a foot in both.
Well, yeah, I think that's fair. I think one thing I'll add to that is that as a founder, when you are bringing in more senior people that are more experienced, that is a skill, right? To do that, being able to work with them as a founder, that is a skill, as you've referenced in terms of training them up to be able to work with an executive, even as you're hiring them. That's a skill. Holding them accountable is a skill because you can't leave them alone entirely. But yeah, if you hired well, they know more than you. So there's a sort of this fine balance that's sort of it's not either or, not all up in their business or leave them alone. It's a third thing that's sort of fairly new. I see that quite a lot. And then it's sort of leading through what I call an abstraction layer. You're sort of leading still, but it's through others rather than through tasks where you're not involved in all the tasks. So I think there's a lot of that transition. So what I want to convey to everyone that's sort of listening is there's a process for that. It's a pretty natural transition. It's got to be done. It's something you got to learn. So someone needs to sort of either you've already done it before, or you need someone to teach it to you. And it's a part of, growing up, so to speak.
Yep, definitely.
So I want to change gears a little bit. You and I talked about before we started our interview, different case study examples. And so I wanted to ask you if there are maybe 2 or 3 companies that you've worked with that shall remain, anonymous, of course, but like what did it look like when you sort of first saw them? What are the founders' perceptions? What were they? What was the underlying root cause, and how did they transition out of that? If you have any stories to share, we'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So I can think of one SaaS platform. The founder had a very clear, big, hairy, audacious goal to scale, right? They want to grow. We want to be multi-million-dollar, right? But they're still running everything. Not really a leadership team to speak of. Typical, technologist, engineer. Product updates were reactive, not strategic. The team was loyal but under leveraged, and the business was overly dependent on like 3 heroes, who have all the knowledge, right? So 3 major single points of failure there. I think what I came into is seeing that the product and engineering function lacked throughput, lacked velocity. Everything was funneled back to the founder for decisions, which they're trying to get it to move faster, but they're the very ones slowing it down, right? And so what I saw was that even the legacy team at this point, right, was starting to get frustrated. They were unclear on the direction, right? This idea of, I want to move from lifestyle to a growth business, no product roadmap. So if there's no product roadmap, guess what? There's no strategy, there's no velocity. Again, all the feedback loops routed through the founder. The amount of technical debt that compounded by the lack of process was just, overwhelming, felt beaten down, right? And when your team isn't winning, right, that creates just this level of drag. So some of the stuff that we started to address right away was the gaps, right? The single points of failure. In this case, right, engineering and product were the bleeding patient on the table that we needed to go after first. There were other areas, but this was the bleeding patient. So we're looking at their process. What were they practicing? They said they were doing agile. They weren't. I don't know what it was. Not quite waterfall, not quite agile. There's not really a name for it, but we installed some product roles to bridge the engineering and the business, created some throughput targets, restructured the product roadmap, really called out the expectations that if the founder wanted to play a role in product and be a product leader, what their expectations were to that role, right? It doesn't just get to be like in and out, crazy hair on fire. Like, you're not going to get any clarity that way. So I think, the goal was to move them from, chasing squirrels and bugs and whatever else comes the way, to driving to an actual product vision and starting to have some metrics in place, right? Like, what is the velocity right now and what do we want it to be, right? What should it be? What are the throughput? What is the utilization rate of the team? And ultimately, we had to get him to that point of an alliance conversation to reposition longtime team member into a more suitable role, more from, moving from a CTO to an architect engineer, even in the short term, finding that replacement, right? We're seeing the velocity go up. We're seeing the wins start to happen. The team morale is improving as a result of that, right? We're seeing those new hires bring in modern skill sets that are complementing the legacy team and bringing in those new processes. We're seeing the roadmap becoming transparent across the organization and people starting to be accountable to that and have metrics that are tied to that growth. So I think the biggest thing that I got that, was a feel good for me is when the founder said, for the first time, I feel like I'm not the only one pushing the boulder up the hill, which I think is huge.
I think that's great. It's funny when you first described sort of the symptoms of where things started when you first started working with them. My blood pressure was going up, my heart was racing, and having this PTSD moment of like, were you in my inbox today? Right? It's that common. It's that much it's very tense thing.
And you know what's so weird though, even though it's so common, like when I'm coaching them, and I say this so many times, I don't know how many times I can say it's like, you're not alone. Like, this isn't,
no, they all think they are
crazy.
They all
think they're alone. They all think they're the only ones that are experiencing this, and they're just the worst in the world, and like, oh, shame on me. And I'm like, no, like, this is normal. These are it's called growing pains for a reason. Like, it's not supposed to be easy. It's painful. That's why only a few people make it. Like, that's the reality.
That is. Yeah, and I love your metaphor of of your client of pushing the boulder uphill or whatnot. When you have a couple of things I want to point out, right? So when you bring in the right person, when you're at a level of maturity, there's a couple of telltale signs, and you mentioned them, but I want to call them out explicitly. So one is the process and metrics. So there is a sequence of which they want work done, right? So you founder, I don't want you involved in every little piece of product development. But every Monday at 2 p.m., I want you to weigh in on these 4 decisions, because these are kind of fork in the road decisions that have an impact on the rest of the business. And that's the point to weigh in. So 60 minutes a week, you weigh in. The other 39, 59 hours of the week, I want you to butt out and stay away from everything else because you're distracting everyone. You're causing more problems, right? So there's a process to the madness, right? Then there's metrics. So you talked about velocity and throughput, right? They're not winging it. They're measuring stuff. So whether it's in sales, it's in marketing, in engineering, in finance, you just see the level of measurement go up. And you can, and this is a good, important sort of connecting the dots, you can only measure things that have a process. Right. So if you're on the soccer field and you pass the ball, you can count how many times you pass the ball before you score on average, right? It's a measurable thing. If there is no passing, everyone's sort of running around a throng, right? There's no order to it. Therefore, you cannot measure it. So if you cannot measure things, often it's because there is no process. If there is no process, the root cause of lack of process is often the wrong leader in that role. So you sort of often get all three of them fixed in one swoop with the right person, because the right person will insist on process, will insist on measurement, and that solves so many problems. So all these issues, so many that come back to having the right person, in the right state. And then the other thing too I'll mention is if you have the right person in place, it's not that you're no longer having to push the boulder uphill. It's more like your direct reports will start pushing you because you're slowing them down. If sort of that earlier stage, it's, when you have the wrong team, you're pushing them. You're pushing your head of sales. You're pushing your head of engineering. You're pushing your bookkeeper, right? And like, is this normal? I mean, yeah, under $1 million, sure. At some point, they should be pushing you. It's like, hey, I got a 5-to-1 LTV to CAC ratio on customer acquisition. I need you, CEO, founder, to get me more capital because I can blow out this budget, no problem, with good ROI. You're slowing me down. You're holding me back. I can't hit my mega bonus because you're getting in the way. I need these 3 things from the rest. I need this release to be on time. These features, it's better be in there because we've already promised them on the close for the next quarter. We need more capital for next year. We're fine for this year, but next year we're not need enough because I can blow out those numbers. You need to get moving because you're getting in my way, right? And so these are people you've hired that report to you, but they're pushing you. That's a good sign generally when you see that.
Yeah, I call that push versus pull. So to your point, right? Like you move from pushing the people to try to get them to do what you want, right? And then there's a lot of resentment and frustration. You're like, for God's sakes, I could do this myself in an hour, right? It's that whole kind of the conversation that plays in your head. And then when you get the right person, it's a pull, right? They're pulling you along now, right? Like they're pulling up not only you, but all boats rise. All boats start to rise.
It's funny. I live in the Pacific Northwest, and so I went walking with a dog that was someone else's dog, and it was a husky.
Did they know that?
Yes, they did know that with permission, right? And so I got this leash on, and this dog's they've been walking for, it's like a 16-mile walk, right? I kind of joined in the last couple of miles, and this dog is not tired, right? Like I'm not a light person physically in terms of body weight, and this dog is pulling me uphill, right? This is mile 15 for the dog. It's mile 4 for me or so. And it's late in the day and they're still pulling, and I have to put my full body weight with good posture so I don't tip over, and I have to hold them back, right? And like that's what it feels like to have the right VP of sales, your right head of engineering. They're pulling you forward, and you almost have to restrain them. Like, yes, I know you can triple blow out sales, but we need to measure it more carefully because of risk with the investors, right? There's other parts of the business where you're going faster than they can handle. So I need to pull you back a little bit, but you're pulling them back rather than you're constantly pushing and they're holding you back. It's just a very important but significant sort of mental shift.
Yeah, most definitely.
Cool. Any other examples of companies you can think of where they've gone through some similar kind of process and just trying to get some color as to what that might look like so that others can simply see parts of their own business and themselves, in these case study examples?
Yeah, so I got an e-commerce SaaS product, and they were in a decline, but the founder was just kind of too embedded in this is the way, right, that we've done it to really see the bigger picture. So much of the decision making was reactive. It was a small group of legacy teammates that were being retained out of loyalty despite the declining ROI, right? The blame, they wanted to blame everything else around them versus like, hey, there's ownership here, right? But nothing has changed. It's it might be time to kind of look inward. They also didn't have a lot of clear metrics, especially when it was tied to like labor costs versus contribution, because as the sales started to decline, the founders like knee jerk, because he had enough profitability and capital to make significant investments, was to throw people at it. And so I came into, oh gosh, like we have overstaffing in some areas with just dismal input or output. The founder was so buried in certain things, that were their hill. No, tribal knowledge existed in people's head. They created this overly complicated like approach and process that couldn't be like you couldn't hire somebody to come in and understand that, because there was no like, this is a best practice, or this is stable. And I mean, it's like, why are we reinventing the wheel? You're not doing anything that hasn't been done before, but
Sure.
We're reinventing the wheel apparently. And so just, profit margins were shrinking month over month, kept just trying to throw more people. So when I came in, I completed a teammate ROI assessment, also did a comp analysis. He also just loved to pay people whatever. He said he wanted people to make what they wanted to make. And I was like, that's not how that works. Like that's
Sorry, the CFO me is like,
how that works.
Oh no, you can't do that.
Well, he didn't have a CFO, which is part of the problem.
There you go.
I was like, that's not how that works. Yeah. So we needed to create one run. They needed a pivot, right, in what they were doing in terms of growth levers and revenue levers. But because they were bootstrapped, right, we needed to give a runway to actually create that change. And there was just so much just extra, right? Like people were buried all over just doing these like this one thing, and they were full time and we're paying them all this money, and they did this one thing. And when we really looked at it, it was like, oh, that's like literally a 30-minute a week job. Like, do we know that? Like, that's what's happening. So we had to rebuild a lot of the roles. We had to right size the team. We did labor optimizations, and we're able to kind of cut about, I think it was like 2.2 in labor spend, at least annualized. And then we started to measure, like, I like a couple of metrics that I typically use when it comes to growth, especially if you're growing through investing in people, and that's revenue per employee and gross profit per teammate. So we measured that, and when they started, I think they were at like 54 cents, which, in case you don't know, that's really, really bad. Typically, we would want to see like a healthy, profitable business that has proper utilization across its teammates to be around 250 to 350. And so we worked over about 19-month period of time and got that up to, I think, about 247 last I checked. And so a lot of that was to create the runway for this reinvestment and this pivot. But the thing that I noticed here was, again, those Franken rolls, or this overly complex, like, oh, it needs to be this little tiny needle in this little tiny haystack right there, right? And if you're looking at the talent market, you're like, well, that doesn't exist. So like, what else you got, or it's not this, it's this over here is common and this over here. So can it be those two things? So that was a lot of what we were working through. And then obviously the classic one that we've already talked about was the same here, the legacy leadership team. And again, I think we turned over all but one in that, and that created, the bandwidth to create more growth focused initiatives. The thing that I've also noticed is, with some founders live way up in the clouds. Like, I once had a founder, we were trying to bring in a business development rep. This isn't this example, but I'm just thinking about it. We were trying to bring in a business development rep, and it was for a new territory that we were expanding in. And I had prepped the offer, and it's the variable comp as part of it. And they literally just needed him to like look it over and sign off. And he threw like a fit in my office, because he was so like big picture, living up in the clouds, like, wanting to share all the things, going out, kissing babies, shaking hands, right? The idea of like having to do that level of detail was just like, he couldn't take it. He hated it. And then on the flip side, like, I get some that are so focused in the details and the tactics that they can't like lift up and realize we can't scale tactics. Like, we can't align people around tactics. Like, we need a vision, and we need strategies. We need common strategies that everyone knows. and everyone knows they can, if they follow that, right, they're going to be pretty much on track. So I don't know, 6 in one, half a dozen in the other. But one of the things that in this case we ended up getting to is that, the founder, it was time for them to replace themselves, like to step out of the business. And that's a hard thing to reach. Some founders, they want that and they're racing towards that. And I just can't wait to step out of the business because I want to start my next thing or whatever. Some of them, like, they don't realize that. And so that's a hard conversation to have and to get to, is that it really is time for you to step out of the day to day and to move over here, move over to your spot, right? And for them, that was, they liked ideas, innovation, and things like that. So here's the spot for you, right? And that is almost the hardest one to replace. I've seen it, like I've experienced it where it's gone really beautifully, right? And it's 10x the business, right?
Yeah.
We found the person, and trust was built, and the handoff was made, and we 10x the business, and it was awesome. We've seen that happen. And then I've seen where it's imploded the business as well, right? And I've seen all the shades in between as well. So that always, like, when you reach that point and you're like, it's not going to go any farther with you here in this seat, right? It's not going to move any farther. That's the message. Now, what do you want to do about it? Do you want to just let it be here, right? If you don't, we have to do something different. And then finding that person, right? Everyone, I feel like I just kind of hold my breath for a little bit. I'm like, is it going to work? Is it not? Only time will tell. We will see. So that's another one that comes to mind. And I like that story because, again, it talks about eventually you're going to have to replace yourself. That's the truth. If you want your business to keep growing, eventually you're going to have to replace yourself.
Absolutely. So a couple of things that sort of jump out at me from this particular example. One is, I think, is, you deal with a lot of personnel, org, right? Interpersonal dynamics, but yet so many things you mentioned were financially oriented. You were talking about KPIs, metrics, revenue per employee, gross profit per employee, throughput of systems, right? Of, sprints, velocity. So there's and one, this because I've told you privately, but like one of the reasons I enjoy working with you is, even though you specialize in sort of this certain area, you are very fluent across all functional areas. And so have a sort of a holistic sense. And by the way, that's what you need in a senior management team, right? So your head of engineering, it needs to be really good at engineering, but they have to have enough sense around sales, right? They've been in sales calls, they've lost sales calls. They have to have enough sense around finance. They've worked with CFOs. They've seen when budgets haven't worked. They have some sense of market, like this feature. Hey, isn't this marketable? But I don't see in the marketing, right? And they can tee things up for their colleagues. And like the good salespeople, like they know a little bit about sprints, they know a little bit about engineering, they know it's easy versus hard, right? They've sort of been around the block. And so you sort of really integrate things together, sort of, I think, very naturally, implicitly, but I wanted to call that out explicitly because that's what you're also looking for in your executives, right? They're aware of their colleagues and they know how to be compatible with, right, their adjacent partners within the organization. So
and there's ways to hire for that too, just by the way, like when you're looking at their background and their journey. And again, there's always exceptions to the rule, but I like, as a rule of thumb, right, if I am interviewing for an executive and working with a founder to find, whatever, but their head of sales, their head of engineering, head of product, and I'm looking at the resume, if all I see are big company names on there and they've been kind of like a cog in the machine, my spidey senses are going to go up. Like I'm good. That's going to be a red flag for me. And like I maybe have seen that hire work maybe 2 times in my entire life. And so again, there's exceptions, but the rule is that typically the folks who make the best are T-shaped executives, right? That's what you're describing there, is throughout their career, they've worked for large corporations, right? So they understand the reality of scale and systems and processes and machines and just like how all of that gets built, right? And how to operate within that. And so they have an affinity and appreciation for process because they know that's what creates scale, is that, right? Repeatable, scalable. But they have spent time in smaller organizations and they have done maybe a few different things within those functions, right? They like, maybe they chose engineering and that's what they've gone deep in, but maybe earlier in the career they were a product manager, and maybe before that they did some business analysis stuff, and you know what I mean. So you've seen some variability there, both in size companies that they've worked for, as well as functions that they've worked in. That's what I like to see in a resume and in a career story, because the likelihood of that person being successful is going to be much, much higher than somebody who has spent their entire life in corporate and has this very deep background, but there's no width there. There's no breadth.
Yeah, and so that term T-shaped skills, I don't know if Harvard Business School created that, or it got
They
popularized
did.
many. Okay, so
Yeah.
it's been a while, and so it refers to the T. So the vertical part of the T is depth, right? They're really good in one area, like they're like in finance or marketing, that's their function area. And the T
Yep.
refers to sort of historically cross-functional breadth. So they've worked in adjacent areas. They'll be better at their depth because they have that breadth. And I think as it goes to startups and SaaS companies, it's also a range of company sizes. Like to your point,
Yep.
I found that's probably my number one when I'm doing like interviews for clients of C-level executives. My number one is, have they worked at this stage size of business, right? If they've never and not even close, I've interviewed people with incredible backgrounds, right? Billion-dollar companies, all brand household names. I know, we all know them, and it's like no. Right?
No.
Because there's everyone's good at a different stage, right? We just talked about that in terms of the relay race. And so what I find, executives that are very good in very large companies, they operate really well when a certain level of things are being done by other people, right?
Yeah.
I'll give an example. I got a colleague of mine, a friend of mine, that used to run a $14 billion a year division of a Fortune 500 company, right? And so one day in a meeting, he goes, I think we should open up an office in blank country, okay? 30 days later, a building's been bought, a lease has been signed, lawyers have been issued, cross-border tax has been figured out, 36 employees have been hired, just because he said it was a good idea. 30 days later, all that happened, right? Now, put that person in a startup with like 10 people, I think we should open up an office and blah, blah, blah. What happens next? Nothing. Nothing happens next, right? There's no lawyers on standby. There's no cross-border tax folks in the department. There's no treasury operations. There's no onboard recruiter in the other country that's on standby. There's no way to build up the org. There's no one who speaks the language. None of that exists, right? So at every stage, there's a certain set of resources that are available that you get used to. There's a certain level of rolling up your sleeves that you got to do. That's different from at 1 million, 10 million versus 100 versus a billion. And so passing the baton to someone who's used to that stage, not 2 stages, not 3 stages, but the next one really is best practice in my experience.
Yeah. So question for you in that, because I totally agree. So when you are scaling, right? Because this is one that I think about a lot, right? How do you hire and how you bring on somebody for the now and the later? Or is it even possible, right? And I think that a lot of founders struggle with that. And what I see most often is that they think they're going to be in the later much sooner, and so they're like hiring for 2 stages ahead of time. Like it's like this extreme one way or the other, right? Like they came from friends and family, right? The no way, shape, or form are at the stage that they're even at right now, let alone can scale, to let me just jump 5 stages so they're ready when we get there. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I like they've worked at the current stage and they've gone like 2 steps from that. Right? And so I think of a step as sort of like a doubling. So if you hire someone at 10 million, they've done 10 million and they've also worked in 20 and 30, maybe up to 40, right? So the current size maybe and then triple the current size, sort of that rough range. And I've interviewed many folks that have been like 10x bigger than where my clients at, and they've done phenomenal things. I interviewed a CTO, CEO candidate a couple of days ago, and they worked at a big company. They started a division of a big company, very, very, very well known. We all are customers, and in 4 months hired 4,000 people. 4,000 people in 4 months, right? Which is an insane level of like insanity, right?
Yeah,
And
250 people a week.
Yeah, and so there's a lot of infrastructure to do that. But started the department with 0, right? So brand new startup, and that from standing start, right? And so I asked him, like, hey, like when you evaluate the software developer's quality of work, like how are you, what's the right way to do it, and are you willing? It's like, well, I do code reviews, right? I'm like, you used to manage 4,000 people. You do code, you're still willing to do a code review? It's like, well, I did one this morning before our interview, and I have GitHub open, right, which is the repository where code is stored. I'm like, okay, so you've managed 4,000 people, and then you did a code review this morning inside GitHub, and you still have it open while we're doing the Zoom interview. I'm like, okay, you're willing to roll up sleeves, right? Because it's a much smaller company. So I often test for how much grunt work are you willing to do if you've done that
Hmm.
stuff? Have you done it? Are you good at it? Are you willing to at this stage of your career?
Yep.
When they've been at that stage, but maybe they don't want to be at that stage anymore, right? Again, which leg of the relay race is everyone optimized for? And maybe they
Mhm.
want to do the last leg, and I need someone leg number two. So I think those things become relevant, and it's the right conversation. I don't know if there's always a definitive, always right answer. What I do
Yeah.
know is that's a relevant factor that needs to be considered. And when it doesn't work, often that's one. If someone doesn't work out, that's often one. Is they're just mismatched to the stage, either too early, right, the founding team and friends and family, or
Yep.
too late, where they're like 3 baton passes away. You're not there yet, ready for them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Cool.
Agreed.
All right. So let's see. As we sort of maybe wrap up, were there any other ones you want to felt burning desire to share, or do you any other case studies?
Um,
Or do you feel
yeah, I can share one more. So this one is more about retiring. Like, the first two were growth
yeah.
oriented, right? Wanting to grow. This is more about the retiring and stepping back.
Okay.
So one of the things, and there's a lot of similarities, but it's just, again, I feel like it's a different side of the coin.
Yeah.
So with this one in particular, wanted to retire, wanted to step back, had no idea how to do it, was feeling like the choice was, I work forever, or I just close it and I let down all of the people, right? And so this was a longer term organization, like 20 plus years. And so I think with them, very similar symptoms. I interviewed a lot of the employees, and I always ask this question: who do you report to? And it's always the founder. Everyone answers it's the founder. And I say, Mr. or Mrs. Founder, who are your direct reports? And sometimes I don't get an answer. They're like, oh, I don't know. Or it's like, oh, well, these are the people, right? I have 5 people or 6 people, but then they really have 40, right? So that was one of the symptoms. They had one of the ways that he had chosen to grow the business over that 20 years is through acquisition, but he never did the work to integrate the businesses. And
Ouch.
so they're running like 4 little businesses, and I'm like, well, isn't that just a productivity drain? So I saw that. I think there was a lot of emotion around his team and like not letting them down. And he had actually a great team that had a depth of knowledge, but maybe weren't promoted or entitled like as a true leadership bench, right? Like, this is your scope, this is your area of the business, you own this. Here's your threshold, here's your decision framework, go, right? So he had actually the people that had the depth of knowledge to go and be great. And then they didn't have a real clear defined roles and reporting lines. And then a lot of the stuff was just kind of in the head, right? Or, oh yeah, we documented that like 15 years ago, and it's out of date, right? So some of the stuff that we did when we came in was we created a shared services model. First and foremost, is like, how are you, like, oh gosh, there's so much gain here. So we combined things like finance, HR, marketing, purchasing, IT through a shared services model. And so that created a lot of like synergy and a lot of optimization and productivity in that. We created again, a leadership structure. These people are reporting to this person who owns this area, right? This people, like, very basic stuff that just had never been done over 20 years. And again, that's your point. Like, I don't come in assuming anything is done, right? Like, there's nothing that a founder can say to me where I'm going to be shocked. Whereas people who come from larger organizations come in with all kinds of assumptions, and they're like, what? You don't have this? What? So that's also worth pointing out. And then the system integration was the next thing. So they were classic multi-system chaos. Nobody like, it just, everybody had these decisions. They did not centralize the decision making for systems. And so all these little systems were everywhere. There were duplications and all of that. So we stabilized that, really focused on ERP alignment and transition. And then kind of coached him through succession planning, right? Finding that next person. And in this case, like, we were very lucky in that there was somebody in the organization, high potential, long time person, knew a lot, and had the desire, right? And so we needed to have the conversation. We needed to outline the succession plan and just start to build that trust. So we did that right away. And the thing that I think is really, really important when it comes to people's when founders are going to step back or they're going to transition on is it's not ever just like a cut and dried, right? It's not a we're done, right? It is a phased transition that evolves over time. And that actually is what I've seen that is best for the founder themselves, because there's a loss of identity too that happens. And they don't know that until they're on the other side of it, right? But I've seen far too many just like close up and then they've literally lost who they are. And there's all sorts of feelings around that. So it is better for the founder themselves. And then the team, right? We're mitigating the risk that they're going to fall flat on their face, right? We have a structure in place and a framework in place, and we have mentorship and advisory because we created a unified governance board as well. So I think that's just a different way, right? Because I said sale, scale, and exit or retire for what's next. So I think that one's worth calling out as well. Is just, there is another option when you reach kind of the end of the journey. It's not, oh, I have to sell to a PE firm that may or may not dismantle my employees and my company, or I have to just work forever.
Got it. And for those, for that client and others like it, do they retire and they're still owners, or are they selling the business and transitioning to somebody else as they retire?
Yeah, so this one in particular, we decided to do what's called a Popeye plan for. So they're a little bit, it's very similar to an ESOP. And the reason we chose this is because they were very emotionally connected with their employees. They wanted to make sure their employees were taken care of, right? That might not be the decision for everybody, but in this case it was. And they didn't need a huge lump of money outside right away, right? So it was also that. And so the Popeye plan over the vesting period, I think it was 8 years, through the growth, right, and the revenue expectations that are set, the new ownership team, which is a team of employees, long time employees, actually becomes the owners.
I see. Got it. Okay, cool. Yeah, so it's another example of the relay race, right? It's just a different sort of anchor leg. And I think one of the common things I'll point out across all the different examples, everything we've talked about, is like when a business is run at the best practice level for that stage, it really sets up all the options for the next handoff to the next stage, whether that's retiring, selling to employees, selling to private equity, or whatnot. It makes it so that not everything's centered around the founder, whether they're retiring or trying to go to the next level. It just creates so many more options. And so that's one thing I wanted to emphasize. The other thing I wanted to emphasize is that like there is a methodology to all this. Like everything we talked about it is not rocket science. But there is some science to it, and there's a bit of an art, right, to that that comes with experience. And there's really no need to like reinvent the wheel. I think at this stage of my career, and I think when we've had our conversations, like it's just we're watching reruns. You and I, we're watching reruns. We've seen this before many, many times. We know how the story ends if you don't do certain things. And there's like 3 or 4 options that are pretty reasonable to consider, and then you kind of figure out which one's the right one for the client with their involvement and whatnot. So there is a method to the madness. And it just sort of, you need to find sort of that right expertise at the right time to kind of get you to where you want to go. So that's sort of been my experience. All right, Georgia, any final thoughts before we wrap up and wrap up for today?
Yeah, I love how you just summed that up, and kind of what I heard when you were saying that is kind of going back full circle, right? I said whether you are, I'm here to help you, whether you are here to scale, sell, retire, or whatever's next, right? And one of the things that kind of occurred to me as you were talking is, but you have to do it on purpose, right? Like you have to do it on purpose, and what that really means is being willing to do the hard things. And so I think there's a operating system out there, and it talks all about the founder can just go be the visionary and do like, oh, you just do what you like and then hire all these other people to do. And I'm just like, that's not true. Don't believe the lie. Like you as the founder,
it's very popular.
I know.
It's very, very, very popular.
It's so wrong because the buck stops with you. You have to be willing to do hard things, because the reality of it is, if it only lives with you, if you're the only one that knows it, then you're the only one that can hand it off. So what I would say is like, what doing that on purpose really means is like you build clarity into your chaos. You create optionality for your future. You have to let go of what no longer fits, and you need to honor the handoff, whether it's from one of your teammates or from you.
Got it. So as we wrap up, thank you so much for your time today. Super appreciate it. I always enjoy talking to you. We always have our private conversations and all this stuff. So now I thought we'd just open up to everyone else. So describe, if you can, as we wrap up, like what does your firm do? How do you add value to companies like this? And for those that are interested, how would they get in touch with you?
Yeah, so I like to describe Hire, Train, Inspire as GPS for small to mid-sized businesses. So we're guiding founders through the out of the grind, right? And placing A players in key seats, helping them scale, sell, or prepare for what's next. So that's the easy way to summarize it. And again, that can mean if they want to retire, step back, sell, or scale, we're going to come in when a founder says, I'm ready for what's next, but the business isn't. And so you can find us by going to hiretraininspire.com, our website, or on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Great. Thank you for that. And again, for everyone else, SaaSCEO.com, which is my company, we provide content, community, and coaching for SaaS executives and CEOs. So I kind of work from board level down to, say, we have VP level. Right? And so we kind of cover the upper end of the spectrum. Georgi kind of covers sort of the full range, and we'll go down all the way to the front lines, which is not something area that we work in, but we work together quite often. So for those that are interested in more interviews like this and more videos, be sure to subscribe to the YouTube channel or visit SaaSCEO.com. And until then, thanks everyone for joining in. Georgi, a great pleasure. As always, thanks for making the time to talk to us about this great topic. I appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.